Sí. Bueno, empezamos. Buenos días a todos, todas. Buenos días. Es un enorme gusto inaugurar el día de hoy la Cátedra José Gaos 2023. En esta ocasión corre a cargo del profesor Franz Berto. Como muchos de ustedes recuerdan, esta cátedra se creó hace más de 4 décadas con el propósito de invitar personalidades de renombre internacional en el campo de la filosofía a realizar estancias de 1 a 3 meses en el instituto e impartir ciclos de conferencias. Se decidió entonces dedicarla a la memoria de José Gaos, filósofo republicano español que tras plantar sus tiendas y elegir a México como su patria de destino, llegó a convertirse en una figura titular para numerosas generaciones de estudiantes y en un modelo de diálogo filosófico a través de las fronteras. Junto a su vasta obra, que por cierto se edita en este mismo instituto, y se han reconocido sus excepcionales contribuciones al cultivo de una filosofía profesional marcada por el doble sello del rigor y la originalidad. De este conjunto de valores e ideales dan cuenta las sucesivas ediciones de esta cátedra, la cual han ocupado en el pasado figuras muy reconocidas, y solo mencionaré algunas, como Donald Davidson, Remo Bodey, Javier Muguerza, Ian Hacking y Sally Haslanger, entre otras muchas. Gracias al intenso intercambio y estrecha convivencia que durante sus respectivas estancias se estableció con cada uno, todos ellos forman parte, en cierta medida, de la historia de nuestro instituto. Deseo agradecer al grupo de académicos y académicas que promovió la propuesta del doctor Franz Berto, así como del Comité de Cátedra Gaos, integrada en su momento por la doctora Tocha Liceda, Guillermo Hurtado y Mario Gómez Torrente, por extender en esta oportunidad la invitación a nuestro invitado catedrático de Lógica Metafísica en la Universidad de San Andrews, así como en el Instituto de Lógica, Lenguaje y Computación de la Universidad de Ámsterdam. El profesor Berto es autor de libros como How to Sell a Contradiction, The Logic and Metaphysics of Inconsistency, como There is Something About Gödel, Existence as a Real Property, The Ontology of y muy recientemente Topics of Thought, en coautoría con distintos colaboradores, han dado a la imprenta asimismo The Mathematics of the Models of Reference, Che cosa es una contraddizione, Ontology and Metaontology, a Contemporary Guide, y también Impossible Words. Y todo ello sin mencionar los innumerables trabajos de investigación aparecidos en revistas de primer nivel como News, Mind, Synthesis, Philosophical Studies, Journal of Philosophy of Logic y un largo etcétera. Gracias a esta suma de trabajos, el profesor Berto es hoy una figura de referencia en los campos de la metafísica, la lógica, la filosofía del lenguaje, la epistemología formal y en particular por sus contribuciones en torno a los mundos imposibles y la semántica hiperintensional. A este último tema y al conjunto de problemas que entraña, dedicará la Cátedra Gaos en esta ocasión. Muchas gracias, profesor Berto, por aceptar nuestra invitación y compartir con nosotros durante su estancia con todo este público formado de investigadores, investigadoras, estudiantes y estudiantas de de la facultad y de nuestros programas de estudiantes asociados, estancias postdoctorales también. Esperemos no solo sacar mucho provecho de su estancia, sino que podamos también entablar una amistad, que contribuya y que nos dé frutos internamente Vamos a explorar también, y eso voy a empezar a pensar cómo lo hacemos con usted, tratar de traducir algunas obras de su amplísima bibliografía, tratar de, estaba revisando y hay muy pocas cosas traducidas al español. Vamos a ver si podemos por ahí también hacer algún trabajo de colaboración en este sentido. Y bueno, sin más, agradecer también especialmente a Aurelia, que se ha encargado prácticamente de toda la logística de esta cátedra Gaos y lo ha hecho de una manera muy eficiente. Y agradecerles obviamente a todos y todas ustedes su asistencia y espero que sea una asistencia constante en estas 3 semanas que vamos a tener con el profesor Berto. Pues bienvenido y le dejamos aquí la mesa para este inicio de la cátedra. Muchas gracias.
Okay, so, hola.
Hola.
Hola. Great to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me. So when I got the invitation, I was very honored and humbled. But then when I read the names of the people who got this chair before me, I got anxious because it was like, no shit. So you had Donald Davidson, you had people like Tim Williamson, and you had Sally. And I started to think, oh, what can I talk about so that I don't make a fool of myself? And in the end, I decided to go for the topic of hyperintentionality for 2 reasons. One is that, well, that's what I've been working on recently. So I'll tell you a little bit about ideas that I had on this topic. And the other reason is that it's a hard topic. So as Mao used to say, there's a lot of confusion under the heavens when it's about hyperintentionality, and that's good. There's a lot of, it's a topic which is really, really booming. There's very different theories, very different approaches. So I hope this is also an invitation for people, especially for students who want to get into this, because it's really an area in which theoretical philosophy in general, not only analytic philosophy, is very lively nowadays. So the fastest way to characterize hyperintentionality is to say that, so if you're a hyperintentionalist, you have troubles with this claim. It's not even a claim. That's the title of the first chapter of a very famous book by a philosopher that I love very much. Maybe somebody can guess who the philosopher is. David Lewis. So the first chapter of On the Plurality of Worlds by David Lewis has that title. Okay. And what is it that is a philosopher's paradise according to Lewis? Well, possible worlds are a philosopher's paradise. Okay. I mean, he meant possible worlds as he understood them. And you may know that he had this crazy metaphysics of possible worlds in which they're like disconnected space-times out there with talking donkeys and flying pigs and so on. And few people followed him down that path. But he wrote the book in the heyday of possible world semantics, right? Because it came out in 1986. So that's after Quine had lost his battle against modal logic. He just lost. Okay, because all of these great works by Kripke and Hintika and Rothbard and Marcus and Montague and Lewis and Stalnaker, okay, all of these geniuses had made of possible worlds and possible world semantics the standard environment to do theoretical philosophy, at least for analytic philosophers. Okay, so that's the philosopher's paradise, the paradise of possible worlds. So you're a hyperintentionalist when you think that that paradise, it's a really paradise. It has turned out to be full of problems, and you believe that in a sense you need to move beyond possible worlds. Okay, that's in very broad strokes what hyperintentionality is about. I'll be a bit more specific in a second. So this is what I plan to do in these 3 weeks. So let's say that I try to follow to some extent Aurelia's suggestion, which was that My Wednesday lectures would be for a broader audience, and I would only allow myself to get a bit more technical in my Thursday lectures. Technical meaning I'll throw some formal logic at you, and I will try to explain things so that even those who don't have a taste for formal stuff should feel at home. But that's more or less the plan, at least for the first couple of weeks. In the third weeks, everything becomes a bit more techy, but hopefully you will still be on board. So to be a bit more specific, today's lecture is not about my stuff yet. It's an introduction to hyperintentionality. Okay? That's why the title was, what the hell is this thing that some people call the hyperintentional revolution? Okay? What are the problems of standard possible word semantics which motivated the development of lots of hyperintentional approaches? Of course, there are some people who are conservatives. They say that, in a sense, there's nothing wrong with good, old-fashioned possible word semantics. Okay, Lewis himself, Stan Laker to some extent, Tim Williamson. These people think that the problems for possible word semantics are pseudo problems, or problems that can be explained away or easily solved. I'm going to talk about this today a little bit, but in particular tomorrow. I'm talking about people who are in tension when they talk about hyperintension. Okay? They don't want to get there. And I will try to answer their objections as well as I can. And I will also start to introduce my own view on the topic. It's a kind of hyperintentional semantics which people are starting to call two-component semantics. We wanted to call it two-dimensional semantics, but the word was already taken because David Chalmers and his friends have been using it. So two-dimensional, that was already used. So we went for two-component. I'll explain to you what it is tomorrow. That'll be it for the first week. And in the second week, on Wednesday, we will go back to topics of general interest, because I'll tell you about Wittgenstein, and I'll tell you about the Tractatus. So next Wednesday will be a day which will be like, oh, how did we get from there to here? How did we get from one of the seminal works at the origin of contemporary analytic philosophy, the Tractatus, to nowadays mainstream possible word semantics? Okay. Because if you look at the Tractatus, there is no mention of possible words there. There's mention of other things. There's him talking about truth conditions. The famous section 4024. Some of you may know it by heart. Okay. That's about what it is to know the meaning of a sentence. It's to know what the world must be like in order for the sentence to be true, right? So that's the idea that meaning is given by truth conditions. How did we get from there to possible word semantics? I will tell you something about this. But I will also try to show you that in the Tractatus, there are the seeds of a different conception of meaning, of a different conception of contents, which is more, let's say, mereological. It's more based on the idea that contents can have parts, and proper parts can be properly included in other contents. And this mereological idea of content is very close to the idea of content that I will try to develop myself, a hyperintentional idea of content. And I will try to show you that that creates an internal tension in the Tractatus. And it's a tension that gave headaches to illustrious interpreters like Ramsay himself and Ryle and other people. They didn't know how to reconcile these different stances concerning ideas on content in the Tractatus. And on Thursday, I will come more into my own stuff. The kind of hyperintentional account of content that I have been developing has been put to work in particular for the analysis of intentional with a T mental states. And you will know what intentional with a T mental states are. They are those states which are directed towards items out there in the world, objects, situations, states of affairs. Okay. I've been working on how to give hyperintentional accounts of belief, conditional belief, supposition, knowledge, knowability, and so on. That's going to be my topic for Thursday next week. And I came up with some logical operators that account for such intentional with the T notions. They are essentially model operators. So in a sense, they're still close to model logic and standard possible semantics, but they add hyperintentional twist to that. And the characteristic is that they are sensitive to certain things that I will introduce to you very gently, and which are called topics. That's why they're called topic sensitive intentional with the T model, so SIMs. And in the final week, on Wednesday, I will tell you something on how to put to work the account that I will have introduced to you in the analysis of indicative conditionals. That's a very difficult topic. You may know that some people think that indicative conditionals don't even have truth conditions. They are often handled by using probabilities. So I will introduce you to a little bit of formal accounts of probability and probabilistic logic. And I will try to argue that if you twist standard probabilistic account of indicative conditionals by adding my beloved topics, you can give a better account, better than the standard ones. In particular, an account that captures relevance for conditionals. Okay, so you see relevance here, but even though I've been working on relevant logic, this will not be relevance in the sense of relevant logic. It will be a different account of relevance, which is delivered by topicality. We will see. And then finally, on Thursday, I'll tell you about my most recent work on the topic of topics. And that's a work that tries to capture the idea of cognitive synonymy. Cognitive synonymy is about what it means that few sentences have the same role in one's cognitive life. Okay? That whatever you understand when one of the few sentences is uttered is also what you understand when the other one is uttered. That the way you are disposed to revise your beliefs when you hear one of them is the same as the way you're disposed to revise your beliefs when the other one is uttered, and so on. That's probably the menu for these 3 weeks. So many of the things that I will talk about are borrowed from this book that I just published last year. It's called Topics of Thought, the Logic of Knowledge, Belief, Imagination. Some of the things that I will talk about, including what I'll talk about today, by way of introduction, is not stuff that you can find in that book. But many of the things that I will talk about during these 3 weeks are things that I only managed to produce with a little help from my friends, people who have co-authored parts of the book with me, or papers on which the book is based, or also other papers that don't show up in any shape in the book, but on stuff that I will be talking about. 3 people in particular. This one is Ibuke Ozgun, great epistemic logician, works on evidence and topology in epistemic logic. She works at the Institute for Logic, Language, and Computation at the University of Amsterdam. This guy here is Peter Hook. He's a great logician, philosopher of language, mainstream epistemologist, works in Hong Kong. And this guy down here is Levin Hornischer, who was a PhD of mine at the ILC in Amsterdam, and now works in Munich at the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy. He's a great mathematical logician and philosopher of language, and he also works on theoretical computer science. Okay, so many of the things that I will talk about are things that come from ideas generated together with these people. Okay, so if there's a mistake, that's their fault. It's not me. Good. Okay. So let's get started with an introduction to hyperintentionality and what the hell it is. So hyperintensional concept is a concept that draws a distinction between logically or necessarily equivalent contents. If the concept is expressed by an operator in the language that we use, let's say H, then H is a hyperintensional operator insofar as H phi, H psi, or phi and psi are just new sentences. They can differ in truth value even when phi and psi are necessarily equivalent. And necessary equivalence normally is understood as coincidence in intention, having the same intention. Okay, And normally intentions are understood in their turn in terms of possible worlds. So we say that sentences phi and psi have the same intention when they are true at the same worlds. And I'm talking just about possible worlds, okay? I've been working on crazier guys, like impossible worlds. Now I'm only behaving and talking about possible worlds, okay? So take any possible world across model space, okay? Possible worlds as a whole represent all the genuine possibilities, all the ways things could be or have been. The two sentences phi and psi, if you look at any point in model space, have the same truth value. When one is true, the other one is true. When one is false, the other one is false. Okay. Then they are necessarily equivalent. They have the same intention. Okay. And you can understand an intention as a function from possible words to extensions, right? And extensions for sentences are just truth values. Okay. So take any possible world, phi and psi are gonna have the same truth value. So they have the same intention. Often people make a distinction between intentional and extensional operators. And they say, well, an operator is extensional when it allows you substitution, salva veritate, of sentences with the same extension, that is to say, with the same truth value, right? So if phi has the same truth value as psi, then also not phi has the same truth value as not psi, right? When you replace phi with psi inside the scope of a negation, at least when that's standard Boolean negation, the one that you learn when you do logic 101, okay, you get the same truth value, right? By the way, I don't think that negation in ordinary language is a Boolean. I think that negation is a model. But again, I will behave and I will pretend that I believe that this is how negation works in ordinary language for now. Okay, so negation, so understood, is extensional, is an extensional operator. And then maybe if you took model logic 101, they told you, well, the box and the diamond of possibility, necessity, they're not extensional operators because substitution salva veritate for sentences that have the same truth value can fail in the scope of a box or a diamond, okay? A necessity or possibility operator. That's a sign that you have an intentional operator. That's one, however, which still allows substitution salva veritate of sentences with the same intention. So if phi has the same intention as psi, so they have the same truth value, not just here at the actual world, but across the totality of possible worlds, then box phi, necessarily phi, has the same truth value as box psi, necessarily psi, right? For the box of necessity. That's where hyperintentionality kicks in. People use the expression hyperintensional for an operator that can fail substitution salva veritate, even of expressions that have the same intention. So hyperintensional means more than intentional in a sense, or beyond intentional. Okay. Good. Now, hyperintentionality is everywhere. Take two claims on your chances of getting a job if you apply for it. Okay. I can be your PhD advisor, and you tell me, hey, prof, what's my chances if I apply for this postdoc? And I can tell you, well, you have 40% chances of succeeding. Or I can tell you, well, you have 60% chances of failing. Okay. Some people say, I told you the same thing twice. I don't think I told you the same thing twice. Because I don't think those two sentences have the same meaning, but surely they are necessarily equivalent if you understand that in terms of possible words, right? They are co-intentional. They have the same truth value in all possible words, right? However, well, if I tell you one, it's likely that you will be more prone to believe in a positive outcome if you apply for the job. Okay. That is a more optimistic sound. But if I tell you two, I say, oh, you have 60% chances of failing. You're like, maybe I'm not going to apply. Right? So you can come to have different beliefs when given co-intentional claims. So belief seems to be sensitive to hyperintentional distinctions. We can believe or come to believe different things depending on how necessarily equivalent options are framed, presented to us. And framing is very important. You may have heard about the framing effect. That's a huge topic in the psychology of reasoning, economics, sociology, and so on, right? In behavioral economics, choice theory, that's very important. People have won Nobel Prizes, people like Kahneman, for research on these topics. Or here's an example closer to the typical examples that philosophers make. Mike is Mike. Mike is Jack the Ripper. Okay? One is necessarily true, right? It's a self-identity claim. It's true across all possible worlds. Suppose Q is true, and suppose that Jack the Ripper works as a proper name. Then also Q is necessarily true, right? Ruth Barkham Marcus told us, Kripke told us, okay? Because that's an identity claim. It's flanked by two expressions which are designators, so they refer to the same thing in all possible words in which they refer at all. So if 2 is true, it's necessarily true as well. So 1 and 2 are true across all possible words. But they have a different informative value. That's just the old Phrygian puzzle of informative identities, right? It's at the beginning of Sinn und Bedeutung. Because 1 is not very informative. You already knew that things are self-identical, right? But if I tell you, hey, your neighbor Mike is Jack the Ripper, that's useful information for you. It could save your life, right? So information seems to display hyperintentional features. Okay, co-intentional claims can have very different informative values. Often people say that the difference between the two is that you can know 1 a priori, you cannot know 2 a priori, you have to carry out some empirical investigation. Well, that shows that a priori too has hyperintentional features. It is a priori that P, that can be true. If you replace P with a Q, which is co-intentional, it is a priori that Q, that may fail to be true. Good. So hyperintentionality is all over the place. It's everywhere. But in the latter half of the 20th century, people believed that they could handle all of these notions by mere intentionality which is not hyperintentional. That's what happened in the second half of the 20th century, which witnessed what many people called an intentional revolution, a large collective effort by people like Hintika and the other persons I mentioned earlier, Kripke, Montague, Kanger, and so on, to account for fundamental notions like belief, information, knowledge, meaning, content, essence, explanation via a single concept, that of a possible world. That's why Lewis said possible worlds are a philosopher's paradise. He didn't like what he called paradise on the cheap. Yeah, possible worlds understood as other people understood them, abstract objects or whatnot. But that's another story. All of these people agreed that the notion of possible world was the core notion in theoretical philosophy, because by using that notion, you can analyze all of these and more. And standard, what I'm going to call standard possible word semantics, okay, which is based on the idea that, well, the contents of meanings of sentences, declarative sentences, are just sets of possible words, right? The set of possible words in which they occur. That idea found applications anywhere. That's one of the few cases in which, hey, a philosopher comes up with an idea, Leibniz, and then it's picked up by other philosophers, and then it's a hit outside philosophy. It's a success story for us, right? Because we exported it to formal logic, linguistics, game theory, artificial intelligence, and so on. All of these people can do modal logic using possible word semantics. But most of those concepts, some people, many people, a growing number of people think today, display hyperintentional features. They're more fine-grained than what you can easily represent by only using possible words. So standard possible word semantics is not very suitable for distinctions more fine-grained than necessary equivalence. Now, this issue has emerged in piecemeal fashion here and there via a series of difficulties for specific applications of possible word semantics. So what I'm going to do next, after this quick intro in section 2 of this talk, is me going through some problems. Some people, as I already anticipated, have denied that hyperintentionality is a real phenomenon. You can have intuitions of hyperintentionality, but they can be accounted for without moving beyond standard possible word semantics. They can be explained away in some sense. In section 3 today, I will talk of some attempts by Stanaker, maybe by Lewis, though it's not clear that Lewis has to be interpreted in this way. Anyway, I'll talk about them. Next, the standard characterization of hyperintentionality is contrastive and relative to standard possible word semantics. So people say that hyperintentional notions are those notions which are more fine-grained than necessary equivalence in standard possible semantics. But then, of course, you get the question, how much more fine-grained? That's a crucial question. We will come to this many times in these lectures. Just how hyperintentions are is an open issue. And also, the mathematical structure of the realm of hyperintentionality is not very well understood yet. I'll talk about this in the final section of this talk, section 4. To summary, let's see if I have the time to get there. One thing we do know already, we cannot totally order hyperintentions. You can take all hyperintentional notions and put them in a line in a total ordering, from the less to the more fine-grained. Okay. Good. Now, there's lots of theories nowadays that qualify as hyperintention. Typically, because they have an account of propositional contents, the contents expressed by declarative sentences, which is more fine-grained than the account in terms of standard possible words. There are very different approaches. Okay, there are two-dimensional semantics by Chalmers and others that I already mentioned. There are theories that take seriously the idea of aboutness and subject matters. I'll talk a lot about subject matters in these lectures. There's truth-maker semantics by Kit Find, who has this ambitious project of doing everything that was done by using possible words without possible words. And he wants to replace them with these things that he calls states or truth makers. He claims that there's only two things that are wrong with possible words. One is that they're possible, and the other one is that they're words, because he wants these things that he uses to be smaller than possible words, in some sense not maximal, and also to be impossible sometimes. Okay? There is metaphysical grounding. There's a huge literature on grounding in metaphysics nowadays, right? Since Kit finds influential criticism of the modal account of essence, the traditional account of essence and essential properties in terms of possible words. And grounding is a hyperintentional notion. There are structural propositions which have been around for a while. They have been the main rival of the standard possible words account of proposition for a while. There's no classical logics which are clearly hyperintentional, like relevant logics. There's transparent intentional logic and more. So there's still much for me to go through all of them. These theories, how such theories are connected to each other, how their relative merits can be assessed, these are largely open questions. Okay? That's why I said there's a lot of confusion under the heavens. Okay? I myself have been working on two hyperintentional approaches, the one in terms of impossible words and the one in terms of topic theory. And in these lectures, I will mostly talk of the latter. It's the one which is more tentative, more recent, and the one on which I will most welcome feedback, comments, and especially objections. So fire at me, okay, and criticisms. Good. Okay. So far, so good. So let's see what these problems with possible word semantics are supposed to be. We have a few of them in an entry of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy called Hyperintensionality. That's me and Daniel Nolan. And in that entry, we divided candidate hyperintentional notions into two camps, one of which is subdivided into two subfields. There are representational concepts. that look like they are hyperintensional. We call them representational because they have to do with ways of representing the world. And how do we represent the world? Well, we represent the world in our thoughts, at least some of them, those thoughts which have intention with the T features, right, which are directed towards reality. Believing, knowing, imagining, being informed, becoming informed. We also represent the world in language. We talk about how things are. And there are notions in semantics, like meaning, content, conditionality that look hyperintentional. And then there are no representational hyperintentional or candidate hyperintentional concepts. Essence, grounding, metaphysical dependence, explanation. So if you came here expecting me to talk about metaphysics a lot, we're not going to talk too much about these. Sorry, okay? It's a bit weird because I'm a metaphysician, first of all, but I got into the realm of hyperintentionality more from the angle of logic, language, philosophy of language, semantics, and so on, and epistemology. Daniel is very much into hyperintension. He's a hardcore hyperintention metaphysician. Okay? So he thinks that hyperintentionality is out there in the world, okay, not just in language and in thought. Okay. It's not obvious that this is a good way of dividing notions. Some claim that explanation, for instance, and some conditionals, according to some people, essentially involve cognition. So they would place them in 1A. The other way around, some people claim that there's environmental information which is not dependent on the mind. But anyway, that's not very important. It's just a useful classification. So let's look at intentional with the T concepts. If there's hyperintentionality somewhere, it's going to be there in our thoughts. But if you look especially at logic, the mainstream logical treatment for intention with the T concepts, like knowledge, belief, supposition, well, that goes back to Hintika. Well, that's a plain model account. It's a merely intentional with the S account, because it just takes such notions, knowledge, belief, as models, restricted quantifiers over possible worlds, right? So Hintika's key idea when he invented what is now standard model epistemic or doxastic logic was, well, let's take belief and knowledge just like the box. These truth conditions for guy believes that phi, guy knows that psi, were just these. So if K is an operator that stands for knowledge or belief, R is the usual binary accessibility relation between possible worlds, which is familiar to us since the 60s, since Kripke. And we read it by giving it some epistemic twist. So let's read an accessible world as a world which is compatible with our evidence, a world which represents how things could be for all we know, a world which is consistent with our beliefs, that kind of epistemic reading of accessibility. Then the Hintikan truth conditions are just these. So one knows that phi is knowledge ascription, or one believes that phi, belief ascription. That's true at the possible world W, if and only phi is true at all the accessible worlds, right? All the worlds that represent doxastic or epistemic possibilities for the person. That's just a box. The notation changing, right? Box phi is true at the world, if and only phi is true at all accessible worlds. And there are also lots of views in mainstream epistemology, which are based on a similar idea, okay? You know something or you believe something when what you know or what you believe holds at a bunch of alternatives, which are epistemic alternatives for you. That's the so-called relative alternatives approach in mainstream epistemology. Knowledge is taken, Preproducción, as an evidential state in which all relevant alternatives to what is known are eliminated. Uneliminated alternatives just work similarly to accessible worlds. There are many different relevant alternative approaches, but they all share this key idea. But now, if you have the standard Hintikan account of knowledge or belief, you easily get a thing called logical omniscience. So the epistemic of doxastic agents are represented are logically omniscient. What does that mean? That's an umbrella term for a number of logical closure properties for knowledge and belief that you get in this framework. So the first one, C1, is often called closure under entailment, or full logical omniscience, because it says if your agent knows that phi and phi entails psi, then the agent also knows that psi. So they know all the infinitely many logical consequences of the things that they know or believe easily. This means that phi is true at all the epistemically accessible worlds. That phi entails psi usually is understood as all the phi worlds are psi worlds across all models. But then also psi is still there, and so the agent knows it or believes it. As a special case, C2, all logical validities are known or believed, right? And thirdly, knowledge of belief is consistent. Now that's plausible for knowledge, unless my friend Graham Priest is right, and there are true contradictions. Otherwise, you can't know a contradiction. But when it's belief, well, it seems that that's not quite right. We may have inconsistent beliefs, but that one holds. These two holds in the weakest normal model logic, right? The K model normal model system. For this one, you just add seriality as a condition of accessibility. That holds as well. So they follow from a basic standard possible word setting. Why is that a problem? Well, one could say, well, we are not like that, right? Well, that's not realistic agents. We know basic arithmetic truths like Peano's postulate, so basic axioms regulating addition and multiplication. This entails, let's suppose, Goldbach's conjecture, every even number other than is the sum of two primes. But we don't know whether that's true or false, right? Or, if not of phi, then phi, suppose that's a logical validity. Sorry, my intuitionistic logicians, but they don't believe that. And so they don't know that, right? If knowledge requires belief. And we experience maybe implicitly inconsistent beliefs. Even Lewis granted that. Well, I'll come back to what Lewis had to say on that. One may say, well, what's the problem exactly here? We know that those are not realistic agents, the agents of standard doxastic epistemic logic. They are idealized agents, right? So one could say, well, perhaps we should reinterpret that notation and read K phi more as something like, well, phi follows logically from what the agent knows or from what the agent believes. Or we could read that as a normative claim, something like the agent is committed to knowing or believing phi given what the agent knows or believes. That doesn't solve all the problems because first, well, we started by looking for a characterization of knowledge, of belief. We were not looking for some derivative attitude, like following from what one knows. We wanted to know what one knows means to begin with, okay? And you could also question the idea that you're giving a normative reading of that operator, okay? One may say, wait, are we really rationally committed to believing everything, given that we have inconsistent beliefs, and let's say classical logic and right? Because from P and not P, anything follows, at least if you're a classical logician. But it seems strange is that just because they have inconsistent beliefs, I'm committed to believing everything. And also you may say, well, you may have a Harmanian view of rationality, view of Harman's view. And if you have that view, you may say, well, it's strange to say that a finite agent like me is committed to believing the infinitely many logical consequences of what the agent believes, okay? So that would be a rational ought without a corresponding can. And it may also sound stupid, right? Because suppose I say, oh, well, I believe that the weather is nice in Mexico City. Therefore, I believe that either the weather is nice in Mexico City or the moon is made of green cheese. That's a perfectly valid inference, but that's a logical consequence of what I believe, okay? But that's a stupid inference to make, right? Yeah, okay, that's a Harmanian view of rationality. Information was taken as a mere intentional notion. It got a model treatment in the classic semantic approach by Carnap and Barhiller. The idea is an agent becoming informed of phi is it's been positioned to rule out the not phi world as contenders for actuality. But then, if the T7 is if Kennedy was shot, then Kennedy was shot, and x to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n has no integer solutions for n larger than 2. That's Fermat's last theorem. They are necessarily equivalent, right? So they should both be uninformative in this account of information because they express the same content, the total set of worlds. But while one easily deems the former true, the latter, well, that was difficult to prove, right? It took 200 years and a proof of 120 pages to show that that's true. A merely intentional analysis of information by a standard possible semantics entails that no logical or mathematical or metaphysical truth can ever be informative and denies the informativeness of logical deduction. But as my friend, the co-author Mark Jago, has convincingly argued in lots of places, obviously logical deductions can be informative, at least for us finite, fallible reasoners. We can become informed of exactly one of two necessarily equivalent claims. And that's the Freudian puzzle again. Of necessity, all woodchucks are woodchucks is true if and only if all woodchucks are whistlepigs is true. That's, again, rigid designators. But while the former is trivial, one may learn the latter from those who know more about zoology, right? Mm-hmm. One may say again, what's the problem? This is a merely cognitive notion of information. So the Bar-Hillel-Carnap account doesn't seem to capture what is informative for ordinary agents like us. But a cognitive notion of information, what's informative for us, finite, fallible agents, makes some controversial sense, and we may try to understand how that works. And if we do that, the Carnap-Bar-Hillel account is not a great starting point. It's the other way around. It's the non-cognitive, merely environmental notion of information, which is sometimes controversial nowadays. Good. Hoping, so I talked about knowledge, belief, information, but also hoping, feeling, supposing, imagining display similar hyperintensional features. Perhaps thought is hyperintentional in general. Okay. Mm-hmm. Lois Lane can wish that Superman is in love with her without wishing that Clark Kent is in love with her. Although, if Bart and Marcus and Crick are right, it's impossible for Superman to be other than Clark Kent. We can suppose that 75 times 12 is 900 without thereby supposing Fermat's last theorem, even though they would express the same proposition in standard possible semantics. Some people think that perceptual states can be hyperintensional too. You can see Mary eating an ice cream without seeing Mary eating an ice cream and John either eating chips or not. Doesn't look like something you can see, but phi is logically equivalent to phi and psi or not psi, right? That is true in classical logic and also in normal model logic and also in various weaker non-classical logics. Semantic concepts, that's the core, because if you take propositions as sets of possible worlds, then all necessarily equivalent propositions are one, the one total set of worlds. Possible worlds can never disagree on them. But again, if Kennedy was shot, then Kennedy was shot, and Fermat's last theorem, they end up meaning the same, the total set of worlds. And that doesn't sound right. For instance, they don't seem to say the same. In particular, they're about different things, right? Only one is about Diophantine equation and how they behave, and the same for necessary falsehoods. Kennedy was both shot and not. 2 plus 3 equals 6. They express the same set of worlds, the empty set, but they don't seem to say the same, right? Only one is about what 2 and 3 add up to. It answers a different question. What do 2 and 3 add up to? It gives the wrong answer, but it's an answer to that question. It doesn't answer to anything concerning Kennedy. Material conditional, right? That's not even intentional. That's extensional. You're familiar with the material conditional from basic logic, right? It's that operator that gives a falsity only when the antecedent is true and the consequent false, and gives a truth in all the other lines of the truth table. And that validates inferences which are often labeled as paradoxical, right? Not phi, therefore, if phi, then psi. X false or positive. If phi is false, then from phi anything follows. right? Psi, therefore, if phi, then psi. Rerum ex voluit. If phi is true, then it follows. If psi is true, then it follows from any phi. Now, there's nothing wrong with the truth function as such, right? It's just the truth table. That's totally fine. There's no problem with the truth table. There cannot be any problem with the truth table. The problem begins when you say, oh, and that captures the meaning of if in English, or similar words in other languages. Okay? If the material conditional captures the meaning of the indicative if, lots of seemingly bad conditionals from ordinary language will come out true, just because the antecedent is false, so the consequent true. If Clinton is Australian, then Mars is made of marbles. If Strasbourg is in Germany, then Clinton is American. These sound bad, right? Some people say you can explain that by pragmatics. Maybe they are true. You don't want to assert them. I think that many think that that's not a good way to address the problem. I think it's not a good way, but I'll get back. I will not tell you about why the pragmatic way out doesn't work. I'll get back to this in our third week when we speak about indicative conditions. Some people said, well, let's go modal. So let's use possible words again. Let's use the strict conditional, which is stronger in the sense that it says, it's not just that, as a matter of fact, it's not the case that phi is true and psi is false. It says more. It says it cannot be the case that phi is true and psi is false. There's no way that phi is true and psi is false. So that's just basically the necessitation of the material conditional. It's impossible that phi is true and psi is false. We still get the paradoxes of the strict conditional, right? Because if phi is impossible, it's not possible than phi, then there is no possible world in which phi is true. And so trivially, phi strictly implies psi, right? If psi is necessary, so it's true at all possible worlds, also trivially, phi strictly implies psi. Right? There's no possible world where the antecedent is true. There's no possible world where the consequent is false. So these turn out to be trivially true in the possible world setting. Yeah, that's what I just said. But if the strict conditional capture the meaning of the indicative if, that's the problem again, lots of seemingly bad conditionals will come out true. If 6 plus 3 equals 11, then Clinton is Australian. If Clinton is American, then 6 plus 3 equals 9. These are irrelevant conditional claims, right? That's why many people don't like these conditionals. They sound bad. There's no connection whatsoever between antecedent and consequent going on. I'll talk about relevance again for indicatives in our third week, not now. On the counterfactuals or subjunctives, the terminology oscillates a bit. I would say counterfactuals because that's the common jargon. Conditionals of the form, if it were the case that phi, then it would be the case that psi, or if it had been the case that phi, then it would have been the case that psi. Also, that one got an analysis that uses standard possible world semantics, right? In the mainstream treatment, which is due to some founding fathers of possible world semantics, like Steinmacher and Lewis, their models, they're analyzed by standard possible world semantics. In a simple version, they are true just in case that the closest, or the most similar worlds, where the antecedent is true, the consequent is true too. Use an example. If kangaroos had no tails, they would topple over, right? That sounds true. Why? Well, look at the most similar worlds where you remove the tails from the kangaroo, they topple over, right? He says, don't look at far-fetched worlds where you remove the tails, but you have them with crutches, or they have wings. They involve gratuitous changes with respect to life. Just look at the closest, most similar worlds where you remove the tails. They're going to topple over. That's why the counterfactual is true. That's the standard of most popular analysis of counterfactuals. But that again makes all counterfactuals whose consequent is necessary or whose antecedent is impossible vacuously or trivially true. In particular, opposite counterfactual pairs, so counterfactuals that have the same antecedent and opposite consequence. Famous example, to Daniel Nolan again. If Hobbes had secretly squared a circle, six children in the mountains of South America at the time would have cared. If Hobbes had secretly squared a circle, 6 children in the mountains of South America at the time would not have cared. Same antecedent, opposite consequence. In the standard analysis, they both come out true because the antecedent is true in no possible world. You cannot square the circle, right? You cannot build a square or is the other one? A circle with same side square is no ruler and compass. Hobbes thought he had managed, but it's a mathematical impossibility, as we now know. But Hobbes making it per impossibile would have made no difference for those 6 children. So one should come out true for this reason. For similar reasons, 2 should come out false. That's the intuition. So the standard analysis is wrong at this point. Or that's the intuition. Maybe it can be explained away. We will get back to this a bit today and especially tomorrow. Okay. Worldly hyperintentionality. Is there such a thing as hyperintentionality that pertains to metaphysics, to how things are out there in the world? I said, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but people like Daniel definitely said, yes, there is such a thing. He finds famous objection to the standard model account of essence, right? What's an essential property of an object? The standard account said it's a property that the object has in all the possible worlds in which the object exists, right? Fine argued that that's wrong. Socrates, famous example by Fine, is supposed essentially human, but not essentially human and a member of a set, even though someone is human if and only if they are human and a member of a set. Right? So Socrates and a singleton Socrates, the set is only memory Socrates, they are modally inseparable if you look across the totality of possible worlds, but, argues Kit Fine, the existence of and identity of the singleton seems to depend on Socrates. The singleton exists and is what it is because there is a Socrates, it is the singleton of to begin with. But Socrates couldn't care less about his singleton or his identity and existence conditions. Kit Fine argues don't depend on what the singleton is doing. Explanation is plausibly hyperintentional. Explains can be flanked by expressions that cannot be substituted with necessary equivalent sama veritate. One pure mathematical truth can explain another, but it's not the case that every mathematical truth explains every other. When Schneider argues that sometimes logical equivalents can explain each other in the course of making a case that because is hyperintentional. Not phi is true because phi is true, not vice versa, even though they are intentionally equivalent, if classical normal model logic are right. And there are sophisticated logics for because nowadays and for grounded. There are logics for grounded. Francesca Poggiolesi has developed some very interesting ones. And they're generally hyperintentional. If the correctness of explanations turns out to depend mainly on how the world is rather than what suits our explanatory practices, some of these cases may be due to hyperintentional explanatory connections in the world rather than to our representations. Also, people like Daniel Nolan think. Okay. Next, I told you that some people try to explain away hyperintentionality. They say, yeah, we have these intuitions, but they're shaky. We can stick to standard possible word semantics in the face of them. And unsurprisingly, some of the founding fathers of standard possible word semantics had this conservative view. One was Stalnaker. So in inquiry, Stalnaker had this strategy to explain away intuitions to the effect that content is hyperintentional. So he says something like this. Given a sentence phi, you should make a distinction between 2 very different things. First, there's the proposition P expressed by phi in the context. Second, there is another proposition, let's call it P star, the proposition that phi expresses P, the first proposition. That one relates the sentence to what it expresses. Now Stalnaker says, whenever it seems that we are ignorant of necessary truths or equivalences, so it seems that we believe or know one, we don't believe or know the other, even though they are co-intentional or equivalent, that's what's actually going on. We are ignorant not about P really, but about P star. He says things like, whenever the structure of sentences is complicated, there will be a non-trivial question about the relation between sentences and the propositions that they express. And so there will be room for reasonable doubt about what proposition is expressed by a given sentence. Okay? So if it seems that, yeah, you believe that 2 + 2 = 4, you don't believe Fermat's last theorem, okay? What actually is going on is that you didn't get that 2 + 2 = 4 and blah, 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 Fermat's last theorem express one and the same proposition, the total set of worlds. That's what's going on. So whenever one fails to know or believe a necessary truth phi, What's actually happening is that one fails to fully grasp phi's meaning. One doesn't realize that it's a total set of words. Does it work in general? I mean, that's work in general, right? Because otherwise, hyperintentionality for contents is not explained away. Now, I think that even if Stanaker's story is persuasive for some cases, actually, I have endorsed the approach in some cases, when it's all cases of ignorance of necessary truths and equivalence to be instances of mere ignorance for it to work as a full strategy against hyperintentionality. And I don't think that works in all cases. Take a mathematician who is wondering whether Goldbach's conjecture is true. We don't know, right? But they can hardly be mistaken on what the sentence every even integer larger than 2 is the sum of 2 primes means. Seems implausible to say that. They know the meanings of all constituents of the sentence, right? We're talking about a mathematician. They have mastered the elementary school maths concepts, even integer larger than 2 sum prime, as much as any of us. They can't be wrong on what the various words mean. Okay. They can't go wrong on every, if they speak English, they're as competent as any of us with English quantifiers. They understand how the syntax of the sentence makes its constituents conjure for it to express the content that it expresses. So they do grasp the content, right? They have doubts on whether that content is true. It's not that they have doubts on what content is expressed by the sentence. They have doubts on whether that content is true. We sometimes seem to fully grasp, therefore, the content of sentences whose status of necessary truths or falsities we ignore. Lewis had another strategy, a fragmentation strategy. That's especially to explain away inconsistent beliefs as apparent failures of logical ambitions. He thought that we can have inconsistent beliefs in the sense that our epistemic state may be split into different frames of mind. You may believe fine in one frame of mind, not fine in another frame of mind, but you may fail to put 2 and 2 together. This example is, I used to think that Nassau Street ran roughly east-west, that the railroad nearby ran roughly north-south, and that the two were parallel. Okay, so he believed in 3 sentences which make for an inconsistent triple, right? There's no possible world in which all of them are true. But he says, well, but my system of beliefs was broken into overlapping fragments. Different fragments came into action in different situations, and the whole system of beliefs never manifested itself all at once. The inconsistent conjunction of all 3 did not belong to, was in no way implied by, and was not according to any one fragment. Does that work in general, even only to explain away situations of inconsistent beliefs, or failure of closure and the logical consequence, or failure to know or believe all necessary truths, or failure to disbelieve all necessary falsehoods? I don't think it works in general. I think fragmentation is one aspect of how we fail to be logically innocent. Actually, I got a paper in which I endorse fragmentation for some cases of failure of logical innocence, but it can't work in general. It cannot be that whenever agents don't follow through the logical consequences of what they believe, it's always because they haven't conjoined the premises, whereas when they do, they suddenly come to believe all the infinitely many consequences. Again, Mark has argued very persuasively. It's often easy to move from phi, psi, and chi to their conjunction. That's a very easy inference to make in many cases. What is often difficult is to see whether a remote theta follows from phi and psi and chi, right? Okay, so I don't think that these arguments work in general against hyperintentionality. There is a very new general argument against hyperintentionality. That is due to Tim Williamson. Tim has started a very aggressive campaign against hyperintentionality. I'll talk about this tomorrow. I'll come to this. It's super new. And because Tim is Tim, you need to be very careful. Because these arguments are very, very smart. I'm going to tell you about this tomorrow. Let's see how I'm doing with time. Oh, I use my. Am I supposed to go for 1 hour more or less? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's how usually works. Or 50-50, but we are in no hurry.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can drop this because it's a bit more hackier I think that was enough for today, and by way of introduction to the topic. Yeah, so do we want to have a little break and then we reconvene and take questions? That'll be fine. Okay, thanks.
Preguntas. Ya hay que empezar.
Preguntas. Yeah. So I'm happy to take questions of any kind. So clarification, doubts, whatever. Do you use the hand finger system? Hand new question, finger follow up, as you wish.
Sure.
Okay. Can you keep your hand up so that I? Okay. So I saw you first. You.
Do you want me to keep track of your questions?
As you wish.
Okay.
Yeah.
So who did you say you saw first?
I saw him first. Yeah.
Yes.
And yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you about the relation with a related phenomenon, especially because you brought Luis at the very beginning, and you presented him as a paradigm of the intentionalist. And then I was puzzled by that fact, because for Luis, he uses, so the key element seemed to be possible individuals rather than possible worlds. And when we consider the case of the set, that is important for him, it makes distinctions that are more fine-grained than possible worlds. And he uses to do with that center worlds or possible individuals. So I would like to ask you a general view about that, but I'm also interested on something that seemed to be, so the set phenomenon is something I'm particularly interested in relation to hyperintentionality. But something in presenting hyperintentionality, you care about the phenomenon of differences. So what is the difference between Miguel is Miguel and I, in the case of the first person, and I am Miguel. But there is also a phenomenon that is relevant, that is set, so that would be the difference. But it's also a phenomenon of sameness that, and it seemed to be something that's going to come near to the end. That would be, but maybe completely unrelated. So for Luis, for example, in the particular case of the essay, it was not only important, this difference between Miguel blah, 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 and I blah, 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 but also the fact that there is a similarity when you believe I am Berto and you believe Berto, etc., etc. So about this relation of similarity and difference, and how do you see the relation, if you can tell something about the relation between the set phenomenon hyperintentionality and also in relation to Luis. What do you think that is paradigmatically an intentionalist?
Good, thanks. Yeah, that's very good. It helps a lot because, I mean, that's why I said Steinmaker and William and Luis maybe speak in defense of intentionality and so on, because there are some elements in Luis's work that point towards a hyperintentional account of some phenomena, and this would be a paradigm of that. So Luis has I think that, so if you look at Lewisian ontology, he has all the resources to make lots of hyperintentional distinctions. And sometimes he inclines towards using some of the tools that he has to account for some specific phenomena in a way that looks hyperintentional. And this would be a good candidate. So I agree on that. I also think it's uncontroversial, though, that there are lots of other phenomena that I would take as hyperintentional and many other people would take as hyperintentional that he refuses to take as in need of a hyperintentional account. One is, of course, for instance, counterpossibles. So he defends the view that all counterfactuals with impossible antecedents should be trivially true. And he tries a pragmatic way out in Counterfactuals, the book. They're all true, we just don't want to assert them. The indicative conditional being the material conditional, so not even intentional for Luis. That's another example. Attempts to explain away failures of logical omniscience as cases of fragmentation of our belief system. That's another example. So I think that, so Luis has all the tools to go hyperintentional, but he goes out hyperintentional only for a few limited range of phenomena And I think that we should go hyperintentional for way more than he would allow. That's kind of my interpretation of Lewis. Actually, I have a paper on how to build a hyperintentional account of propositional contents, which only makes use of Lewisian tool. For instance, he would have a merely intentional account of properties, now getting more metaphysical. Properties are just sets of their instances, right? And he can have that account, and he can claim then that he's given a merely extensional account of properties, right? So the problem is like, I don't know, having a heart and having kidneys. That's a usual Freudian example, right? They are coextensional, at the same word they have the same extension, but here they have different properties. And so many people say, well, that shows that properties are not extensional. But he says, well, I can still take properties as sets of their instances because I have all of my possibilia. So the extension isn't the same. If you look across the whole model space, there's going to be possible worlds where there are animals that have a kidney but no hearts, and there's going to be possible worlds where there are animals that have a heart but no kidneys. So if you look across the totality of possible worlds as one big realm of possibilia, you will be able to make the relevant intentional distinctions, even though you stick to the claim that properties are just sets of their instances. But then you wonder, so how about necessarily coincident properties, like having three sides and having three angles? And when he gets there, he comes up with an account that looks like a hyperintentional account. It's a kind of structured account that builds hyperintentional properties out of material which he has. So that's an example of Lewis having a sketchy attempt at a hyperintentional account of properties just by using tools that he already has, his concrete possible words and the possibilia. So I think he had all the tools. Sometimes he looks at hyperintentional accounts. He doesn't do that as much as I would do. Okay. He had all the tools. He could have been bolder. Yeah.
Just also, sorry, just for the first part of the question. Yeah. So you deal with these hyperintentionalities related to these differences. Is there anything in similarities that is related to hyperintentionality? Because I have never thought about that. So in the case of the say, when two people believe we have different truth values within the world with this idea.
When I speak about similarity, you think that we should resort to counterparts or counterpart theoretic account for this? Is that the view that you would?
It's just that I need to be able to accommodate the idea that you and I, when we believe I am Mexican, in this case, I am Spanish. It's true in my case and false in yours. So this is something that Lewis also wants to capture. And given that the say is so closely related to hyperintentionality, whether you think that this other phenomenon, which is closely related to the say, might also have anything to do with the hyperintentionality.
Yeah, I think it does. But I'm not sure that the best way to deal with it is to buy the Lewisian apparatus of counterparts and counterpart theory.
Stop it.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture. It was a very good introduction to the wide phenomenon of hyperintentionality. I want to ask you something about something that you warned you're not going to talk about. It's about the metaphysics of hyperintentionality. It is perhaps more curiosity than a philosophical worry or something like that. Tell me, I've got the impression that you don't want to get into metaphysical issues when talking about.
Yeah, you guys.
That's the suspicion I have. But then, what I want to ask you, and I think perhaps this is the moment to ask it in this first lecture, not later when you are going to talk about the specific issues, is that why you don't want to get into this metaphysical issues? And I have two more questions. Did you think that we can deal with the problems of hyperintentionality keeping the same ontology as the one we have with the standard possible word semantics. And if you think that we cannot keep that same ontology, how would you think we should extend that ontology?
Okay.
And I was wondering, for example, if you have considered accepting beyond objects, properties, relations, sets, possible worlds, something as modes of things, or as Héctor Neri Castañeda called them, guises.
Yeah.
That's the solution, the ontological solution that I would like to see. I've written about those things. So I was just wondering if you would go along those same lines. Yeah.
Good, thanks. I'll take them backwards because the last one is the most difficult. And the first one is the easier.
Okay.
I don't think you can use guises to make all the hyperintentional distinctions that I think should be made. But it depends a little bit where you want guises to fall. Do you want them to fall on the side of content and semantics, or do you not? If you want them to fall on the side of content and semantics, then your guises, I think, are going to start looking very much like Freudian senses or that kind of stuff, which is that has been raised as an objection against certain accounts of guises, like Nathan Salmon's account. If you want, I'll get back to this. If you want them to fall outside of content, so guises have some kind of cognitive constraints or something like that. Do you want them to work compositionally or not? If you want them to work compositionally, to embed compositionally, again, I think they will start looking very much like Freudian senses, of senses in disguise. If you don't want them to work compositionally, then again, I think they will not manage to do all the work I think should be done to account for hyperintentional phenomena. That's a very sketchy and a bit of a dogmatic way of presenting things. But yeah, because for instance, Salmon, when he introduced guises, it was clear that they were not meant to be components of content, because Salmon and also other people, they were Russellians on propositions, and they liked the direct reference account of names. So when they introduced distinctions that were supposed to be modulated, so represented by guises, they didn't want guises to be part of the semantics of names. Okay, so the meaning of a name is just the bearer. So modes of presentation are not part of the meaning of name. Okay, so when Lois Lane loves Superman and it looks like she doesn't love Clark Kent, the meaning of Superman Clark Kent is just a damn thing, and it's the same thing. So the distinctions that they wanted to make, they had to fall outside of semantics and outside of content. But then in order to do the full job, they would have to treat guises in such a way that they start looking like Freudian senses, like the superhero wearing the costume, or the shy journalist with the glasses and so on. Tomorrow I'm going to talk a bit about this. I think there's a kind of dilemma here for people who want to use guises and they want them to fall outside of content. But I'll get back to this tomorrow. Okay, so that's just anticipation. The second one, ontology that comes with possible worlds. I don't think there's any single ontology that comes with possible worlds. So the fact that one subscribes to possible semantics commits one to no specific ontology, because there are people who work, as a matter of fact, there's people who use possible semantics who have all kinds of divergent accounts of the ontology that comes with them, and on the metaphysical interpretation of words. You can endorse possible semantics, and you can be a Lewisian on possible worlds. There's very few people like that, but it was him and a couple of other people. And then your ontological tool is the following. You take worlds as disconnected spacetimes, basically, and you have all of those possibilia, which are things out there in flesh and blood, which inhabit those other worlds. You have this rich ontology to work with. But you can also be somebody who endorses possible world semantics, but metaphysically speaking, thinks that words are abstract objects of some kind. It can be a Plantingan, words are maximal possible states of affairs. You can be a linguistic ersatist, as Lewis would say, on possible words. They're just maximally consistent sets of sentences from your favorite word-making language. You can also endorse possible word semantics, but you can be a fictionalist on possible words. So you don't even believe that there really are possible words. You just make believe that there are some such things. There's more than fictionalism. So I don't think there's any single ontology that's clearly linked to somebody endorsing possible words as an account of content, possible word semantics, and so on. First question was the easiest. Why am I reluctant to get into hyperintentional metaphysics? That's just contingent. I think partly it's got to do with the fact that the most prominent hyperintentional accounts in metaphysics nowadays are some version or other of grounding theory. That's really exploding. I'm not too attracted to that. Just there's too many people working on that. Some of the questions that they ask, I'm unable to follow. That literature grew very quickly and is now very specialized. And I haven't had the time to look at enough of the things that are being published in that ballpark. So it's a merely contingent reason. I'm not into hyperintentional metaphysics because I have been unable to keep track of explosive development of grounding theories. So that's why. Yeah.
So, Ricardo, keep in mind that there are 20 minutes for questions.
Thanks for the talk. So it's a question about standards that tend to get around hyperintentionality.
Yeah.
So most days I tend to think that this attempt is just misguided because, as you said, it seems ridiculous to think that a competent mathematician doesn't know the meaning of Goldbach's conjecture.
Yeah.
But on a few occasions, I tend to think that maybe Staunacher's view is not that unreasonable because presumably there is a non-trivial connection between the conjecture and the intention that is true in every possible world. So, supposing that the conjecture is true.
Yeah.
What the connection is,
Yeah.
It's let's say it's up for grabs for now. But so let's take one mathematician who's thinking about the conjecture. For sure, she doesn't know whether the conjecture holds this non-trivial connection with the necessary intention.
Yeah.
Right. And then you may think, well, that's not enough for Staunacher because I don't have to agree that that intention is the meaning.
Yeah.
Right. But then why if what would you say if Staunacher replies with whatever the meaning is, that meaning is like very tightly connected with that intention. Actually, it better be that meaning is such that it's true relative to all possible worlds. And if the mathematician doesn't know, whether the conjecture is connected to the necessary intention, then it's not at all obvious that the mathematician at least understands very well what the meaning of the conjecture is.
Yeah.
I'm not confident about what I'm saying. I'm just wondering about what you would say in reply.
So I think I myself agree on everything. But that's because the account, my favorite hyperintentional account of operational context, which I have not introduced yet at all, I'm going to talk about this starting tomorrow, has it that, so it implies, and it implies that the meaning of that sentence is extremely tightly connected to that intention, the one which is through at all possible words. I think that intention doesn't exhaust the meaning. So there is more to the meaning or to the content of Goldbach's conjecture than the set of possible words at which it is true. And in fact, the account of meaning that I will try to sell you is such that one component of the propositional account, one component of the proposition expressed by that sentence is exactly the intention which is true at all possible words. But that's not the whole content of that. So there's another component. That's why it's the account that I'm going to sell to you. It's called the two-component account. because it adds to standard possible semantics another component.
Just yes, very one question.
Yes.
So then would you say that the mathematician only partially understands the meaning of this sentence, or fully?
No, fully understands the meaning of the sentence. And according to me,
Okay.
the meaning of that sentence is made of two things. And one of the two things is a set of possible words given the two conditions. And in particular, it's the total set of possible words. But there's another component on which I told you nothing about.
Okay.
That's the one that I couldn't
Now
stop
wait
it,
for
yeah.
Over there, there is listen.
Yeah, thank you, I'm Simon. Thanks very much. I was wondering about salvo veritate substitution. You gave the classic kind of characterization of hyperintensionality, where it's a failure of substitution salvo veritate, even for necessarily coextensive terms. I wonder if there's anything positive one can say about substitution. Are there any kinds of substitution that do still preserve truth value in hyperintentional context, or maybe there are kind of different grades of hyperintentionality with different, some preserve some kinds of substitution, others don't.
Yeah, good. That's a great question. First, I think that's a key problem for anybody who has a hyperintentional account of anything. So which are the substitutions that still hold for the operator for which you are giving a hyperintensional account? That's a core question. So it's a great question. And it's also great because it's about the slides that I skipped. Yeah, so here's one thing that I can tell you for sure. You may hope for a total ordering of hyperintensional notions, where the idea is take any two operators, x and y, supposedly hyperintensional. Either x is at least as fine-grained as y, or y is at least as fine-grained as x. So you can put them on a line, total order. Okay, that's the idea. That's wrong. My former PhD, Baron Holmischer, has a nice mathematical proof. I will not get into that, but I'll give you an intuitive example. There are also in ordinary language incomparable hyperintensional operators. So they're such that there are sentences such that the substitution, so 4 sentences, substitution of 2 of them works for one but fails for the other, and the other way around. Substitution for the 2 fails for the first but holds for the other. Intuitive example. Take Lois Lane knows that. That's an epistemic one. And because Lane, the ones that people who do grounding metaphysics love. Because Clark Kent loved the Guggenheim Museum. And take these 4 sentences, phi, Clark Kent loves the museum, psi, Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum is true, chi, Clark Kent is in New York, theta, Superman is in New York. Okay. So Lois Lane knows that phi, Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum, if and only if she knows that psi, Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum is true, because hey, Lois knows how truth works, right? She knows the Tarskian schema. Lois knows that psi, Clark Kent is in New York, but she doesn't know that theta, Superman 2 is in New York, because she's not aware that Superman just is Clark Kent. Right? Classical case of ignorance of identity. But then it is false that phi, Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum because Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum, supposing that facts cannot explain themselves. Why it is true that psi, Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum is true because Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum, supposing that truth is grounded in facts, or supervenience of facts. So natural assumptions on how truth works and on supervenience and on explanation give these. And also finally, on the other hand, chi, Clark Kent is in New York because Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum, if and only if theta, Superman is in New York because Clark Kent loves the Guggenheim Museum. Well, Superman just is Clark Kent. So knows and because are incompatible. There are substitutions that work for one and not for the other, and the other way around. Given that they are hyperintensional, as I think they are, there is no total ordering for intuitive hyperintensional notions. Okay. Maybe that means that you cannot have a single theory that handles all hyperintensional notions. Maybe that means that, well, at least they can be partially ordered. You can have a partial ordering. Maybe concepts belonging to a single subfamily, for instance, the representational semantic ones, can be internally totally ordered. I don't know, because you see that nose is a representational one, knowledge is a state of mind, there's many things, including myself. Because is only belongs to metaphysics. Or maybe the identification of totally ordered subsets of the partially ordered set, maybe a way to group such concepts into nature or cabinet joints. There's PhD work to be carried out there, folks. Okay, that's all open issues. That's all I can say for now. Yeah, so in the coming days, I'll tell you something about how I see a hyperintentional account of beliefs to work, hyperintentional account of knowledge, and I will try to argue that they have a certain level of fine-grainedness, but not more. There will be some substitutions that go through even for my favorite hyperintentional accounts of knowledge and belief. I will not say a lot about because, but hey, as I said, not a lot of metaphysics in these lectures. Sorry again.
Excellent.
Okay, I try to be fast. There's a couple of questions. The way you get hyperintentionality from intentionality is completely analogous. How you get intentionality from extensionality. So this suggests that you can go off and up and keep going. I didn't think it right. Is there any work on why does it stop at hyperintentionality and then go hyperintentionality or hyper?
No, in the sense that because hyperintentionality has had this merely negative characterization, so it's more fine-grained than mere intentionality. There's no limit in the sense that you can have a maximally fine-grained hyperintentional account of propositional contents in which any two syntactically distinct sentences get different propositional contents. That would still be labeled as hyperintentional, but most people would reject it, right? I mean, people believe in proposition because they believe that different sentences can say the same thing, can express the same content. So nearly anyone who works on hyperintentional accounts of propositional content is gonna stop short of that. You don't want to get so fine-grained because then you have no point for semantic contents anymore. They're just as fine-grained as the sentences. But some people get there. So Graham Priest, crazy, open, impossible worlds, not closed under logical consequence. And he says that that's good for very anarchic states of the mind like imagination. So Graham thinks you can imagine whatever you like. And because you imagine that P, it doesn't follow that you imagine that Q for any distinct sentence Q. And his account is so fine-grained. But many think that goes a bit too far.
Okay, yeah. But aren't there many spaces between the collapse and the lowest hyperintentional distinction?
That's underexplored territory. Underexplored territory stage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Santiago?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about idealization. So very often when you find problems of logical omniscience, people make the move of saying, well, we are idealizing. And you don't like that move. However, there are cases in which we want to use imperfect models of a given target domain to explain that domain. However, you seem to think that in some cases that's not what happens. So I wonder what the reasons are behind that reaction. And I was thinking that maybe the reaction was related to you don't have the same subject matter you wanted to explain at the very beginning. And then you could elaborate a little bit more about how that plays out in the debate.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of confusion there too, in the sense that people often mix the different senses of idealization. In one sense, idealization is about building simplified models. So idealizing is just simplifying for the sake of theoretical simplicity, having manageable models that allow you to make certain predictions and so on. Sometimes people mean by idealization, when they do epistemic logic, formal epistemology and so on, the representation of idealized agents, right? That means that has a normative sense. So those agents represent a normative idea. Those are the people who would say, well, yeah, you may not believe all the logical consequences of what you believe, but you should. Okay. You may never get there, but that's an idea that you only approximate. People often mix the two things. And in a sense, that's right, because sometimes a model is very often models can be idealized in both senses. So the Hintican standard epistemic logic is idealized in the sense that it's heavily simplified, and also you may interpret it as representing agents which are normative ideals. Okay. But it's a mistake to confuse the two things. Sometimes you may want to represent a certain phenomenon, and to represent that phenomenon, you de-idealize your model, and you don't take a stance on whether that still has normative force. It's just a representation of descriptive phenomenon and so on. So it's important not to get confused. The apparatus that I will introduce in the coming days, I think, is good for representing a certain number of phenomena that you cannot easily represent if you use standard Hintican epistemic logic, like framing effects, for instance. It's good for that. Sometimes we can not believe Q, P and Q are co-intentional, but they are about different things, and that's why we tend to believe one and not the other. Am I representing a normatively idealized agent still or not? As you wish. You may have a Harmanian view of rationality that takes into account our cognitive limitation, or you may be a hardcore scholar who thinks, no, still, it's a normative ideal that we should be logical omniscient. Okay, that's very non-Harmanian. I don't care. It's whatever you like.
I have a very naive question. May I ask? Yeah.
You're the chair, so you can do whatever you want.
So I thought that there was a moment in the slides in which you were talking about fragmentation, and then you said that fragmentation, in a sense, supports hyperintentionality. I was wondering why you cannot assess the cases of fragmentation with possible words.
Yeah, I didn't claim that fragmentation supports hyperintentionality. My view is that the representation of agents whose belief or knowledge states are fragmented can handle certain phenomena that have to do with our failure to be logically omniscient. So I agree with you is that sometimes our mental states are relevantly like that. Okay, they're fragmented. What I don't think is that you can do all the work only by invoking fragmentation. And there are possible worlds models, some models that only use possible semantics. They have fragmentation, and they're fine because they represent a range of phenomena which are interesting phenomena and so on. My claim is you cannot address all the phenomena that require a hyperintentional approach just by adding fragmentation to a standard possible world semantics framework. So that's how I see it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Para la siguiente conferencia, que es Tension about Hyperintension, ¿no? Con todas las objeciones contra la hiperintencionalidad. Gracias.